from the book, very thought-provoking. It's a biography with a difference, allow me to say so, from 3 caveats to the coda. Almost 200-page a book in 2 segments. Book 1, which covers the life of Dr. Ambedkar in 5 chapters, and book 2, his legacy, again in 1 chapter with 4 to 5 subdivisions. As we all know, kindly please take your seat, all of you. Dalits in identity, as Dr. Tharoor says in the book, in the fractured Hindu society. Dr. Ambedkar's greatness cannot be reduced to any one of his accomplishments because all were equally extraordinary. As a biography, the book takes through the life of this personality, the struggles, the challenges. I love the beginning of the book, which narrates a train journey of 3 boys, literally painting in words, where we don't have to say that doctor's command on the language. He literally paints scenarios. The situation of those boys, how they were treated, the untouchables basically, it starts with that. And then we move on to the political battle of Dr. Ambedkar with giants like Nehru and Gandhi, and the making of the constitution, the rich book. Well, Dr. Tharoor, my first question, it's a collection of inputs from the audience as well. The first question would be, why Ambedkar? What led you to the choice of this stocky, bespectacled, untouchable lawyer, as you say in page 52 of your biography?
Well, because of his extraordinary life, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks to all of you, it was astonishing that this gentleman, born in such humble origins, could have led the life he did and accomplished all that he did. That would have been astonishing even in a person born to much more affluence and privilege, like, say, Jawaharlal Nehru. To have achieved everything that Ambedkar did was remarkable in itself, and to do so from his background is almost incredible. That is, the background of somebody who was an untouchable in a society where that meant really horrendous privations. Imagine he is the smartest kid in his class, but whereas the smart kids are supposed to sit in the front of the classroom, he has to sit in the back in a corner, and he's not allowed to sit on a chair and a desk. He has to sit on a gunny sack, which he then has to remove and take with him when he goes home at the end of the day, because none of the peons or the school staff will touch his sack because an untouchable has sat on it. He cannot drink water in the school unless somebody is available to pour it for him from a big distance. But if he goes and touches the tap himself, he gets beaten up because an untouchable should not touch the tap. These were the kinds of privations he had to go through. And when you think about this, and I talk about many other such episodes early in his life, and how despite all this horrendous discrimination, he rose above them to the accomplishments that I mentioned to you 15 minutes ago. Those accomplishments are truly remarkable distinctions. And the fact that he is now so popular, he's grown in stature after his death, he's admired across the country. There was an online poll conducted some years ago for the greatest Indian ever. And it was he who won ahead of Mahatma Gandhi. So there is clearly a reverence for him amongst the public of India. This is a poll in which apparently 20 million people participated. So you have to understand that we're talking about an exceptional individual. And I think understanding what made him who he was and why his legacy matters to all of us was what the task I set out to do. And I hope that all of you, when you read the book, will also get a sense of why Dr. Ambedkar mattered.
The next question, again, several questions from the audience as well touches upon that, you as a congressperson. And throughout the book, we see Dr. Ambedkar's strong criticism of Gandhi. And he describes the era, Gandhi era, as the dark era of India to that extent. Now, the blunt attacks. How do you, as a congressman, respond to this? Not as the author of the book, but as a Congress leader.
No, but you have to understand the context and the history. For Dr. Ambedkar, the most important thing was the eradication of untouchability and discrimination against the people, left out of the caste system. And he had an intellectual critique of the caste system, as well as a bitter reaction to the lived experience of it. And this is why he felt that while the Indian National Congress was fighting for freedom, in his view they were fighting principally for the freedom of the existing social order with the existing upper castes on top. And for him, the more urgent task was to fight for the freedom of the Dalits within Indian society before you can put independence ahead. So that was his fundamental disagreement with the Congress. As to Mahatma Gandhi, he kind of disagreed with Mahatma Gandhi at various levels. He disagreed with Mahatma Gandhi's claim to speak for the untouchables. He felt that no person of a higher caste could appreciate what the untouchables were enduring. That was the first disagreement. And he felt that untouchable people from those communities, the so-called depressed classes, had to be able to speak for themselves, to represent themselves. Secondly, he didn't find Mahatma Gandhi's approach towards Dalit upliftment to be anything but patronizing. For example, Mahatma Gandhi invented the word Harijan, people of God, children of God. But he said, we are all children of God. Why is it that you single out one community and say they're children of God as if the others aren't? We don't accept that term. And in fact, Ambedkar used various other terms. Mukh or silent, Bahishkrit or excluded. He even used the English word untouchable or the formal terms depressed classes and later after 1935 scheduled castes. But the word Dalit only came into use very late in his life, and he personally didn't have to use it, didn't have a chance to use it so much, but he didn't want to use the word Harijan. Then there was this disagreement about fundamental issues of political philosophy, whereas Gandhiji, for example, believed in an India of self-governing village republics. Ambedkar considered the villages to be dens of iniquity and sinks of ignorance and prejudice. So he wanted to override the prejudices of the villages by urbanizing India, and he had a much more top-down approach. He wouldn't agree with Mahatma Gandhi on that. So there were example after example. Gandhiji's approach and Ambedkar's approach were completely opposed to each other. I think part of the greatness of the Indian national movement in the 20th century was that it incorporated all of these diverse points of view, and that everyone was able to come together in making the India that we know today.
Yet another point, this is to all the women out there. An interesting point which I came across is the feminist that Ambedkar was, where he says about his wife and a husband being equal in all aspects. And even before that, somewhere he speaks, in the same context he speaks, one should not be a slave to the other. And also he's telling about how marriage is a liability and urging parents to be wary of getting your girl children educated and before getting them into a marriage, etc., which is like, do you look at it as a foretelling of things?
He was probably one of India's first male feminists.
Yes.
In terms of his approach. If you read speeches he made in the 1930s and 1940s about and to women, he really spoke with a very progressive mindset that even today would be considered fairly advanced, such as the example that Raji gave. He would tell women, don't let your parents force you to get married too early. Study, create your own independence.
And
do not have to be in an unequal relationship in a marriage. You are equal to the husband, stand up for your rights. Bring up your children to be aware of their rights. Even in his own work as a politician, as a legislator, for example, he fought hard for women's rights, for equal wages for women. In fact, he even tried to introduce a bill that would permit birth control for women. It was shot down by the conservatives who felt that it would promote immorality. But Dr. Ambedkar, knowing that his own mother had died after giving birth to 14 children, he felt that this was a torture. He even said that if any man had to go through what women go through to produce a child, no man would agree to have more than one child. That was Ambedkar's own observation. So he was a tremendously progressive intellect when it came to the rights of women and the needs of women. I must say that a lot of us today, a lot of men today, could learn from what he talked about and what he believed.
Those were some of the best parts of the book, which I felt personally, and I'm sure the women out there would agree with me. So do the men. Please do get a copy of the book and read it. It's really interesting. And the sea of references towards the end of the book shows the vast amount of research that went into the book. And you must have picked it from different, of course you've written that. Throughout the book, which I felt, this is my personal observation, Ambedkar sounds a very difficult personality. Being apart, as you put it there, and also his incident with Dilip Kumar, and also the tough arguments with Gandhi and the odds with Nehru. What is your observation? Because you describe it as determination, a man of determination.
No, he still was a difficult man, I think there's no doubt about that. But you can argue that he became a difficult man because of his experiences. That somebody who had suffered so much of discrimination and torment, who had to fight for even the most basic things. Imagine having to fight for a glass of water. You come back from having got a PhD in Columbia University and an advanced degree in London and being a lawyer there, and you come to India and no one will rent you a house to stay. And you spend a night in a park with all your belongings scattered around you weeping because you've been thrown out when they discover you're untouchable. I mean, these kinds of experiences would be enough to make anybody bitter. Gandhiji himself said that one should understand Dr. Ambedkar's bitterness. The fact that he doesn't want to break our heads, we should be grateful for. It shows that he has enough self-restraint to not break our heads. That was Gandhiji's comment. So we have to understand that given all of that, the fact that he was a bit short-tempered, that he didn't suffer fools gladly and so on, is much more understandable. But if you crossed him or came on the wrong side of him, it wasn't very easy or very pleasant, definitely, because fighters can also be difficult. And certainly was quite testy with people. Raji mentioned how he met the actor Dilip Kumar, who wanted to make a donation to a couple of colleges that Ambedkar was founding in Aurangabad. And Ambedkar was not interested in getting any money from an actor. He was India's #1 matinee idol. But Ambedkar gave him short shrift. And so these things surprised people. That why did he behave like that? But that's the man he was, and we have to accept that everyone has character traits which may not necessarily meet everybody else's taste, but that's the person he was. He didn't have to be likable in order to be great, and he was great.
One last question on the book before we move into some general questions. Of course, the audience would love to hear from other aspects as well. The North-South issue, which you describe in the book, again, there is a reference. I would like to hear more from you on that.
Well, you know, Ambedkar was very conscious of both the pluses and minuses of creating linguistic states. This was a problem that he wrote about quite early on. And he understood that in India, the South, as he saw it, was much more cultured than the North. It was much more, that in many, many respects, the people of the South had a certain, shall we say, refinement that he felt was lacking in the North. He also saw that these differences could be overcome through the structure of a constitution that gave everybody equal rights. And he was anxious to create a sense of individual agency. Don't forget that the British had ruled India through communal concepts and through a communal divide. That is, that they would essentially see Indians according to their community first, whether it was their religion. They would see Muslims as Muslims and Hindus as Hindus, whether according to their castes, according to their tribes. They used to dismiss entire groups of people as criminal tribes. They classified entire people as martial races. They saw people as collectivities and not as individual human beings. Ambedkar in the Constitution went out of his way to empower the individual. It was the individual Indian citizen who won agency. And that was a very important contribution he made. Another very major contribution he brought about was this question of fraternity. He talked about liberty, equality, and fraternity. But though the phrase is familiar to us from the French Revolution, and for him too, I'm sure, he wanted to situate those values in ancient Indian practices, and he saw them as virtues emerging from Buddhism and the Buddhist way of living. And fraternity became a very important concept that he brought into the Constitution. But he did say that his big worry was that our democracy was going to be a top dressing on a soil which is essentially undemocratic. The top dressing is the system of the Constitution and the state. The soil is Indian society, which as a victim of discrimination, he felt was inherently undemocratic. And it was very important to him that we should try and transform society as well, and not just make other kinds of gestures. He quarreled with the Nehru government on the question of the Hindu Code Bill, for example, which was not adopted in his time. It came finally in 1956, ironically the year of Ambedkar's death. But he was impatient for social change, because that for him was the most important yardstick to determine how India had progressed and how India would move on.
Now we move on to some
Questions from the audience?
questions.
My God,
Yes.
all right.
Let me begin with a question from a Bahraini citizen, Mohammed Ashur. Thank you, Mr. Ashur, for this question. How should India reconcile with its colonial past in order to progress? How should India fight colonialism, current disguised form of empire in our present times?
Well, I think the colonial past is, of course, a crucial issue. The colonial past is a genuine issue because, in fact, even though it's now been 75 years since we were freed, the stamp of colonialism has changed very many things about our society, about our economy, and inevitably about our politics. So I've written a totally different book on the subject, An Era of Darkness, which was published in the UK called under the title Inglorious Empire. And we spoke about that book on the stage before. I will say, however, that one of the most difficult aspects of colonialism is the colonizing of the mind. And we are trained to think about ourselves in categories that the colonial power has imposed on us. And because it's very important for us to recapture our own history, our own culture, and our own self-confidence. And this is something which is an ongoing challenge in a society like ours. But to give the gentleman an answer in 1 minute or two for a vast subject like colonialism would not be possible. I will simply say that the principal evils of colonialism were the amount of resources it drained out of India over a period of time. Professor Usha Patnaik has estimated that at 45 trillion pounds is the value, economic value drained away from India by British colonial rule. And then you've got all the other things that were done in India to benefit the British rather than to look after the welfare of Indians. So it really left behind a very distorted economy and a very distorted society. They also managed to, in order to facilitate their rule, they managed to actually ossify certain practices. It is often said that the caste system, for example, became more entrenched with the British, that the Hindu-Muslim divide didn't exist before the British constantly went out of their way to create it and foment it on the principle of divide and rule. That if they could divide Indians by religion, they would be able to rule India better and more easily. And so on and so forth. These are all legacies we're still fighting to overcome.
T.G. Matthew, to paraphrase your quote, how do we curb the decay in the historical and cultural context of our great nation?
Well, I think that's a task that is a permanent, ongoing challenge for all of us. It's happening, I mean, to some degree it's happening with each government of India, whether it's the government that I was part of or the government of today. They're all trying to restore, revive, rebuild, create new institutions, build new infrastructure. The dramatic use of technology, the so-called Indian tech stack and so on, is a way of actually enhancing inclusion in India. I would say that yes, there is a lot of decay around in institutions and buildings and dilapidated infrastructure and so on, but we're now grappling with that and overcoming it. It's an ongoing challenge, nothing will happen overnight, but people are working on it, governments are working on it, politicians are making. And every time a politician promises you something, make sure you hold them to that promise, and then we will overcome our decay.
Will you write a sequel to your great Indian novel?
Go on.
That's a question, sir. A question from Mr. Viju. Will you write a sequel to your great Indian novel?
I'm sorry?
Will you write a sequel?
No. You know, each work has got an integrity of its own that stays in its own time. The Great Indian Novel was written between 87 and 88, published in 89. It's a book about where I took the stories and legends and philosophies of the Mahabharata and I applied them in a satirical way to the political history of 20th century India up to that time. So it was basically the nationalist movement, independence, and the first decades after independence, including the emergency and so on. That was the culmination of the novel. And it was a lot of fun to write. It was also my first novel, so I had no idea if I'd pull it off. I put everything into it, to throw in the kitchen sink, as it were, into the telling of the story. The Mahabharata itself is a compendium of so many stories, so many retellings. And the book, the Great Indian Novel, has something of that character as well. Lots and lots of stories, digressions, incidents, poems, jokes, all sorts of things are all in it. And I hope you will enjoy it as it was written at that time. But there should be no sequel because each work has a certain integrity of its own. It stands for itself. And I'm proud, it's like you produce a child. You let the child go out in the world on its own. You can have other children, but you can't try and repeat that child again.
A question from Amit Bansal. The literature from India is in two categories, English language and local language. The one in local language is closer to the culture and the soil than the other, but it is in the latter which gets more popular due to a colonial hangover. And so how do we make local language literature more popular and more recognized on its merits?
It's happening, Mr. Bansal. He's a writer, I see. Good to see you. It's happening because of the excellent improvements in quality of translation. What is happening now is that you're seeing a lot of books in Indian languages being translated and therefore getting more accessible. In the old days, a book written in Hindi could only be read and appreciated by people who read Hindi, same with Bengali, Gujarati, Malayalam, and so on and so forth. Today, because they're being read more and more in translation, they've acquired a national and then an international stature. Now you can find very fine Hindi novelists, Bengali novelists, Kannada novelists, Malayalam novelists, available in French, in German, in Spanish, because now, thanks to translations, they have become more accessible. So I think the era in which only the Indo-Anglian novel, the literature written in English about India, only that was getting worldwide attention, that era is now over. And you saw recently the International Booker Prize going to Gitanjali Shri, who writes in Hindi. So there is now a much greater recognition for Indian writing in Indian languages, and I think that's how it should be. I'm proud to say when I was first translated into French more than 30 years ago, I said to my French publishers, I'm very glad you've done this translation, but why don't you do translations from Indian languages also? Once the reader is reading in French, how does it matter to them if the original is in English or the original is in Kannada? The truth is, or in Malayalam. The truth is, it's still a novel about India, and that's what they want to know about. So they said, well, find us translators. And so wherever I knew people with those language backgrounds who were in France, I would introduce them and say, why don't you try your hand at translation? It'll give you an income and it'll give these writers some recognition. And that's what it worked out. Today it's a thriving industry in every language.
A question from Shama. For others it's yoga, and still for others it's tons of sleep. What makes your clock tick? How do you read, write books, give speeches, and be a politician? All with a smile and a flick of your hair. There you go.
I wish I had the patience for any of those activities. I'm really a bit of a slob. But I guess what I have is a certain level of self-belief. I'm driven by God knows what it is that makes me keep these impossible hours and undertake the impossible schedule I take and still stay awake and write and not sleep enough and all of that. But I can't say that I claim any special privilege for it. We are all the way that we are meant to be, and I think that if you are much more comfortable sitting, putting your feet up and watching television all day, maybe that's the way you were made. I happen to be made in this way. I won't claim any particular credit for it.
A young parent, Kiran, has a question, who is a parent of 3.5-year-old daughter. What advice would you give to, about reading, I believe, reading, knowledge and diction like yours? On that note, Dr. Tharoor, I would want to ask you, the diction, your diction is of great interest to people. Of late, there was a social media flick where you typed the spelling of authentic wrong. And there were more than the comment, more than the quote or the post of yours, people picked on that spelling. They went on saying like, we checked the dictionary, that is a new word.
Yeah, I'm a very clumsy typist on the phone, and because my fingers are too fat for the phone keyboards, I often make spelling mistakes. Usually I catch them and correct them, and sometimes I don't when I'm in a hurry.
Have you ever felt this is a burden on you?
It is sometimes a bit of a burden. I mean, the truth is that other people can make typing mistakes and people just guess what they are. When I make a typing mistake, people think, is this a word we should know? And some of them are really obviously typing mistakes, but anyway, that's all it was, nothing more serious.
Kiran asked, what did your parents do to you to get this diction?
No, I mean, look, I happen to be blessed with a good ear in the sense that this is the English we were taught to speak. I went to school in Bombay with teachers who spoke like this and who expected us to speak like them. And it so happens that as I said, I picked up the language. It may help that because my father was in a transferable job and was moving from city to city, we grew up with English as the principal language everywhere. Whereas other Indians, having an Indian language as their principal language and English as a second language, naturally the Indian language inflects their English. And so the Indian pronunciations and so on, whether it's, I mean, there's often a joke when people explain that why Peter Sellers is not funny to an Indian is because what his accent sounds like a Welsh accent, not an Indian accent. Because an Indian English accent has to have either a Punjabi tone or a Malayali tone or a Bengali tone. Each of those Indian language speakers has a different kind of Indian accent. And those of us who manage to avoid an Indian language imposing itself upon our English, we speak like this. And I'm certainly not the only one. Both in the school I went to, the schools I went to, and subsequently in college, there were many others. But I also went to a school where there were things like elocution contests where people who spoke clearly won the prizes. There were debates and so on, but again, speaking was highly prized. I also was enrolled in drama classes with Pearl Padamsee, the famous theatre personality and film actress. And Pearl, I was one of her first students and she taught me. So all of these things also influence the way I speak, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I think I'm proud to say that when I speak French, I also have no particular accent. And when I speak Malayalam, I insist I don't have a particularly, definable accent. It's a question of how you manage to pick up the language as you hear it spoken. Let's move on from words.
An interesting question from Biju. Yesterday, Mr. Tharoor blamed Pandit Nehru for the education system in India. He said Panditji gave more focus on IITs and first degree education and kindergarten education were ignored. Rather, less focus was given. Do you agree?
No, first of all, I think it's to Pandit Nehru's credit that we had the IITs and the IIMs and so on. The basic infrastructure of scientific and technological knowledge in India was laid by the vision of Pandit Nehru. And without it, we would never have had the revolution that has transformed India. The whole, what was initially seen as a brain drain to Silicon Valley, which has since become a brain gain for us. The entire software revolution which came out of the IITs that enabled us to take advantage of the famous Y2K panic at the turn of the millennium. And how many of you remember that anymore? And now the fact that the entire image of Indians in the West has changed So much, from naked fakirs lying on beds of nails or snake charmers with their baskets to a land of computer geeks and software gurus. That's the image now. Now, I remember being accosted some years ago at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam by an anxiously perspiring European saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? The understanding is that Indians must be the experts in all of these things. But that transformation, the ground for that was laid by Pandit Nehru. At the same time, you could argue that basic education, particularly in the villages, particularly in mother tongues and local languages, was not given the same amount of resources and the same amount of emphasis. That is true, but you can also ask what kind of resources did we have in India in those days that you could actually spend everything you wanted to on everything. I agree that we could have made more emphasis on basic literacy, basic education, and primary education. But given that we had limited resources to allocate, the fact that we laid such an excellent groundwork at the top has stayed India in good stead and made a lot of today's development possible.
Indra Kumar Kapoor. How important is proper and correct implementation of a project or a system? Your comments on population control by Sanjay Gandhi, demonstration by Modi, GST by Modi, what difference it would have in development of Bharat Mata? It's a combination.
No, I think it's the basic question of how important is implementation. Obviously, it is most important. Anyone can have ideas, and in fact, too often in our country, there is an assumption that politics is about sloganeering and dharnas and so on. I beg to differ. I mean, the actual implementation of anything is what delivers. I mean, we already had the example that Radhakrishna Pillai mentioned of your evacuation planes. You have the great idea of the plane, you have the people with big hearts who raise the money, you have the people ready, everything, somebody who's volunteered, drawn up the list and all of that. But unless somebody follows up at each stage, chases the officials, gets the permissions, make sure that there's permission to clear these people to board, make sure there's permission to take off, make sure there's permission to land. If you don't touch all of those nuts and bolts, it won't happen. When I became MP for Thiruvananthapuram, there was a project that I learned about. With tears in their eyes, people were telling me that stones had been laid in their land 40 years earlier for a highway bypass. And that if nothing had ever happened, their land became useless. No one would buy the land because the government markers were there. It was going to be acquired for this new highway. So they came to me and said, either please get the project cancelled or get it implemented. But for 40 years, our lives have been on hold. And so I went off and I successively saw ministers of the government, 3 different ministers. I saw the officials of the National Highway Authority of India. I had to persistently work patiently. At every stage of the process, there were whips to be cracked, things to be done. Notifications had to be issued, then they had to be implemented within a certain time, otherwise they would lapse. This project had lapsed 3 times already in those 40 years. But what the difference that I was able to make was to pursue the implementation at every stage. Even when you got the thing approved, got the budget, the Gazette notification issued, it wasn't enough. Because I discovered that it could not be completed without surveyors surveying the land, and all the surveyors had been transferred out. So I had to chase the revenue minister and get the surveyors resent back to the survey department to finish this in time. Then when it was all done, I had to make sure that the minister signed off on this within the 12-month stipulation, or it would have lapsed again. Now, it's because I took an interest at every stage. I chased the minister at his holiday home, got someone to carry the file to him so it would be signed in time, and I personally called the printer of the government gazette to make sure that the final notification came out within the deadline. That's why this project happened, and after 40 years, this highway bypass is being built. I'm proud of that, but I'm also proud of the fact that I understood it wasn't enough just to, write a letter to a minister and sit back. Things have to be done step by step, and that's why implementation is so important.
Common man's question. I would club 3 questions. This is for the congressmen out there, the Khadar-clad here. When elections get completed, normal practice is that we see MPs are being taken to resorts, or the MLAs. Is this a kind of threat to Indian judiciary? When is this going to come to an end? That is one question. Another on the same line is, like, a person like you, how did you fail in the election? elections, the recent elections for the Congress head. Since you joined Congress, which of the two has happened? Shashi influenced Congress or Congress influenced Shashi? Questions from Biju, PK, Prakash and Manav.
Okay, well, I think we can take them in reverse order. I have tried to be myself while being loyal to the party. And I joined the party when I came into Indian politics because my views were a matter of record. I've been writing books for 40 years. And so people know what I stand for, my vision of India, my vision of India's pluralism and diversity, the need for coexistence of people of different backgrounds, religions, and so on. All of that is essentially what I believe in. And I found that the Congress Party was the closest to my broad vision. Though I may not have agreed with the Congress on every single thing, on this broad understanding of India and my sort of liberal instincts, Congress seemed to be closest to me. But there are many things, obviously, in any party where the way the Congress functions, the people function, even within the question of the beliefs of the party, the broad ideologies there, but they stand on individual issues, on specific laws, on specific controversies. If you're a member of a party, you have to go along with something whether you fully agree with it or not. So I've stuck to my guns. Where I took a stand that I believed mattered because it was the right thing, I took a stand irrespective of party. One happened in my own constituency when the state government opposed the privatization of Thiruvananthapuram Airport, where the bid was won by the Adani Group. And I said, first of all, that you could have objected when the government listed Thiruvananthapuram amongst the 6 airports to be privatized. The Kerala government did not object at that time. Secondly, the Kerala government participated in the bid. And then having lost the bid to Adani, it then objected to the privatization and the award to Adani. I said, that is not correct. You can't go and play a sport. And after you've lost the sport, you can't complain about the game or the rules of the ground or whatever. If you participated, you accept the outcome. That's democracy. But the Kerala government then got all the opposition parties, including the Congress, to unanimously pass a resolution supporting the government's stand that the privatization should be reversed. I said I disagree because I'm a member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram. The people of Trivandrum want a good international airport. They want progress. They don't want this to be mired in endless disputes about privatization. What has happened has happened. We have to move on and get a better airport. And I'm pleased to say that though at that time I was roundly attacked and criticized that who is he to oppose the stand taken by all the parties, at the end it is my view that has prevailed. They have all gone quiet and the airport is progressing and developing. So ultimately, to that degree, I think I've stayed the course with what I believed in. On this presidential election, I think it wasn't surprising perhaps that the establishment rallied around its own and that they supported their own. But I would like to think that the mere fact of having forced an election, the fact of having given the Congress workers a choice, the fact of having got the whole nation talking about the Congress, all of this has both influenced the Congress and helped the Congress. Because during those 3 weeks of the presidential election, I think there was more favorable coverage of the Congress party than in the preceding 8 years. So something good has come out of it.
A question on media from Biju. Advertisement-funded media. Is there a problem with the media today? Will subscriber-funded media change things for better?
It's a difficult one because media, in the old days, the expression was a free press. And a free press is free not only in terms of being free to write what they wanted, but it should also be, as far as possible, accessible to everyone. Now, if it becomes subscribers only, then only the affluent will be able to have access to authentic news and high-quality news. Already, right now, many newspapers, many websites have paywalls. And often that denies that, for example, to students who can't afford it, scholarship students, poorer families, or people who frankly just don't have the time to go and pull out their credit card every time they want to read an article. And I think that is a bit unfortunate. I personally would prefer to have sources of news being free and accessible. The old model was that it was advertising that paid for the news. So if the news was good, more people read it, then you could charge higher advertising rates because the advertisers could reach a larger number of people because the news was well presented. So the more popular newspapers charged higher advertising, and in the process the readers were found it free. Today that model is crumbling because, of course, once you're in the internet space, advertising is much less effective. It's much easier for you to skip ads and you can focus precisely on what you want to read and so on. And that's where this business of paying is coming in. I'm personally not so convinced that's good for the media. We need to wrap up soon,
Yes.
because I believe I have to head to the
I asked
airport.
3 questions. Are you or were you ever nervous while speaking in the parliament? Hemant Nambiar.
Of course one is nervous. No, certainly on some issues. And particularly in Parliament, there's a certain sanctity to Parliament. Every word you say is recorded. A permanent record exists that, who knows, historians and students who are not yet born will one day be reading and studying. It should have a certain weight. I've always taken my speeches in Parliament very seriously. I don't believe in doing it lightly or off the cuff. I believe that what I say has to be weighed carefully, every idea, every thought, and every word also. So I'm very careful that I speak. People ask me after why I don't speak in Hindi in Parliament very often. I give Hindi sound bites outside Parliament to the media, but I don't want the risk of any mistake of gender or grammar or whatever coming into the permanent record, whereas when I speak in English, I'm pretty sure I know what I'm saying.
You're a very busy person. How do you find time for such extensive reading and writing so many books with facts? Dr. Tajuddin.
Well, I think the books need to be thoroughly researched and written, and ultimately a lot of my reading tends to be centered around book projects. I used to read a lot more for pleasure than I'm able to these days. Nowadays, pretty much the only reading I'm doing is directed towards material I need for a book I'm writing, or for something I'm doing, like reviewing a book for a publication. Very rarely can I just pick up a book because the cover attracts me, or the author attracts me, or the theme attracts me, just for the pleasure of reading. As it is, most of my reading now is on planes. Because when I'm sitting at my office desk, between the incessant stream of visitors and phone calls and meetings, there is really very little time to read. So it's often only on planes when you're not being disturbed. And nowadays with airlines like Emirates offering Wi-Fi, even that freedom is going to go. You'll have to do your emails also on the plane, I fear. But otherwise, that's when I read, and I'm afraid I don't read nearly as much as I would like to.
Casey, at a tremendous rate. Do you have enough resources and employment in the Casey?
India's population is increasing, yes. But you know that as long as the economy grows, population can be an asset. That is, the more productive hands you have to keep your economy humming, your GDP also goes up. And it's not necessarily an asset unless you are unable to find meaningful employment for people, and they are then unable to generate resources to sustain themselves in the economy, and you have a very, very large underclass of poor, starving, malnourished people. That's a disaster. So it all depends on how well you manage it. We have been very critical of the present government because of unemployment. We've had the highest levels of unemployment ever recorded since numbers were kept. And we believe it's essential to both skill and train our young people to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that the 21st century offers, and to ensure that the economy grows in a way that provides employment opportunities for all of them. That remains a fundamental challenge. If we can do that, and there is a serious effort underway, of course. I'm not saying the government isn't trying. I don't believe they've done it well enough yet, but if it can be done and accomplished, then the actual growth in population may not be a liability. Already, there are some declines being noticed. Kerala, for example, if there had been a census, would probably have been the first state to show negative population growth since the previous census. Had there been a 21 census, which didn't happen because of COVID, Kerala would have dropped in population. By 31, we expect Andhra Pradesh will also drop in population. And you will see more and more of the northern states where at the moment fertility rates are very high, also gradually coming down. So it's a question of development, of education, and of the evolution of people's thinking. I suspect that our population will peak somewhere around 1.7 billion, maybe 1.8, some people say, in the course of this century, and then come down again. And 100 years from now, our population may be even lower than it is today. The population is a cyclical process as well. Some countries like Japan are already much lower population than they used to be a few decades ago, And we can look forward to that, but over a longer time frame, because we have 65% of our population under 35. A lot of young people who are still going to produce children. But eventually, our curve will go up, it'll then plateau, and it'll come down eventually. Probably not in the lifetimes of anyone in this room, but that's a process we can look forward to. Thank you.
Last question of night. A very interesting question. Being a Malayali, do you know to cook? What is your favorite cuisine? Thanks, Bharatha Nambiar, for that question.
Well, the honest truth is that I'm an idli nut. I don't know if that's a particularly Malayali trait. It's a South Indian trait, all right. So the only thing that I forced myself to be able to cook from scratch were idlis. Because even in New York, when I was working for the United Nations, I would soak the rice and the urad dal and grind it and ferment it and let it sit there, and then on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, I would sort of sit down and make a whole series of batches of about 88 idlis in one go, and then I would freeze them all. And every morning I would take out 3 or 4 and thaw them and eat them for breakfast. So that's the one thing I could do. I can't claim to have any talents on the culinary front. Beyond that, it's partially the fault of growing up as a young Indian boy in the 50s and 60s. Because you only entered the kitchen to ask when food would be ready, when breakfast would be ready or lunch would be ready. You were never expected to contribute to the kitchen. Things have changed. My sons are both excellent cooks now in Washington and New York respectively. So they are an improved version of the original. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Sir, I would appreciate if you take a couple of questions from the audience. There is time for that. No. See, if they want to ask, stand up, even in Malayalam, because there are so many Malayalis. So, yeah, just ask. Give questions. A quick question. One or two.
So I appreciate you because you are colonial, thinking about the British rule in India. So you are colonial. Looting of British during their stay in India. Why can't we compare this? Adani is doing now as an investor. For example, building a project. It's a great concern for the people, those who are on the, especially the fishermen folk. What is your opinion about that? May not be a repetition of the colonial thinking in a later stage.
No, I mean, you can look at the rationale behind why successive Kerala governments wanted a seaport in Bahrain. It goes back to 1992 when then Minister M.V. Raghavan first proposed it. And subsequent governments, the Antony government, the Umar Chandi government, 2 or 3 successive communist governments all tried to create a port in Bahrain. In the end, Mr. Adani won after a process of various tenders being disqualified and so on. So it was a fair bid. The reason we wanted that port is that we have some tremendous advantages in India. All the goods that are coming to India today are transshipped in containers. So the container ships have to dock in deep water ports, and then the containers are unloaded and put in smaller ships, which are then sent to India. Because in India there is no deep water port that can take the big container ships. So Colombo and Dubai and Singapore are profiting from goods being bought by Indians in India because they have the ports and we don't. That was the reason why we wanted to create a port. The other strategic reason is that Colombo has essentially come under Chinese control. The Chinese have not only developed much of Colombo port, but there's an entire new section of the port, entire phase, which is totally developed by the Chinese, and Chinese naval submarines are calling in it. So 70% of Indian goods are going through a port under Chinese control. It's an unacceptable national security challenge for us. Bahrain is the only natural port in the country with 24 meters of undredged depth. It is only 8 nautical miles from the shipping sea lanes. So as a national interest question, the need was to have a port there. Plus, of course, we also hoped that building a port in Bahrain would help develop the surrounding area, that they would give local employment to people from the area, that at the same time, when ships came and docked there, crews getting off and so on, there'd be a lot of spin-off effect and lots of the local people would get benefits from this. So these were the logic for creating the port. Now the current agitation against the port is based on the theory that increasing coastal erosion has happened because of the construction of the port. This is not yet proven. The fact is, I am an MP for Thiruvananthapuram. From my first year as an MP in 2009, there have been cases of serious coastal erosion. Beaches have been disappearing. Houses have been toppling into the ocean. I have been raising the question of sea erosion in Parliament, not once but 6 times. I have even written to the Prime Minister saying if China took 2 inches of our land, the whole nation would be up and arms saying Bharat Mata ki Bhumi. But here Bharat Mata ki Bhumi is being taken away by tax from the sea. 64 square kilometers of my constituency has disappeared in the last 10 years into the sea. And yet no one is doing anything about it. So this is a genuine problem, whether it's caused by global warming, whether it's caused by other patterns, changes in tidal patterns in the seas, whether it's caused by human agency and human construction. These need to be established by studies. So I am 100% sympathizing with the people of Vizhinjam and the fishermen's community in particular about many of their demands. But on the specific request that the port should be stopped as they want, because they say the port is eroding the coastline, on that I have said let the work continue, but let us do a study and establish whether the port is truly responsible, because the honest truth is the nation can't afford to stop a project like this. It is too important for India. That's the broad context. Whether Mr. Adani is doing it or somebody else is doing it is irrelevant to me. It is the nature of the thing. If Mr. Adani bid and won the bid, if somebody else had bid tomorrow or the Kerala government wants to do it themselves, the issue would be the same. Does building a port cause coastal erosion in the leeward and windward sides of the construction? That's the issue, and that requires expert judgment. But other countries have ports, they are prospering. Should Kerala be the only place where we don't have a port which will help the country? It's a tough question to answer.
Okay, no more any heavy questions. Let I would like to throw some questions.
Good evening, sir. Good evening. Meet you. So as Mr. Pillai mentioned, my question is broadly on a lighter note. I was heard you speaking in Malayalam quite often. To me, it sounds because of the edges that your English language has or the language of Malayalam, it resembles something like risotto with Moravichakuta, you know. So the undertones of the ethnicity of the language, of the Palakkad language, I think that's... Yeah, so my question related to the language is, can we look forward to a Malayalam book from you?
But my books have all been translated into Malayalam.
I'm not talking about translation, I'm talking about an original version.
I wouldn't risk that. For the same reason that I don't speak Hindi in Parliament, I wouldn't write first in Malayalam. അത് ശരിക്കും നമ്മൾ നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അതിന്റെ വലിയൊരു ഉദാഹരണമാണ് O.V. വിജയൻ. അദ്ദേഹം ആദ്യം ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് മാത്രമേ പഠിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. 12 വയസ്സ് വരെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ പഠിച്ച് വളർന്ന ഒരു കുട്ടിയായിട്ടാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം പറഞ്ഞ മലയാളം പഠിക്കണം. And he taught himself Malayalam and wrote in Malayalam, which was amazing. Then he would often translate his own Malayalam books into English. That kind of brilliant bilingualism is very, very rare. I would not be as confident. I can make speeches in Malayalam, but I know they're full of mistakes and people will forgive me. I wouldn't dare to do that in writing.
So, Delhi
പ്രസിഡന്റ് ഇലക്ഷന്റെ കഴിഞ്ഞതിന് ശേഷം അങ്ങ് സോണിയാഗാന്ധിയെ കണ്ടപ്പോൾ 2 കാര്യം ആവശ്യപ്പെട്ടു. ഒന്ന്, സ്റ്റിയറിംഗ് കമ്മിറ്റിയിലേക്ക് എടുക്കരുത്, വർക്കിംഗ് കമ്മിറ്റിയിലേക്ക് ഞാൻ വരുന്നില്ല. അതുപോലെ തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് ഈ മത്സരിക്കുന്നില്ല. ഇതിൽ എന്തെങ്കിലും സത്യമുണ്ടോ?
തീരെ സത്യമില്ല. രണ്ടും ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്, രണ്ടും ആലോചിച്ചു. തിരുവനന്തപുരത്തിലെ എനിക്ക് നൽകിയ വിശ്വാസം ഞാൻ എന്തിനാണ് ചതിക്കാൻ പോകുന്നത്? മൈക്ക് അവരുടെ കയ്യിലാണ്.
You want to or release
It's now 15 minutes later than I was supposed to be. I must go.
On a lighter note, now you've been writing for 40 years. So is there any book or any article you feel that now at this juncture of life you would have read it or dealt with it differently?
You know, I genuinely believe that people who think and reflect will always find things in life that they should regret. I don't believe that anyone is so perfect that everything they've done is exactly right, and certainly would not always be right for all time, because sometimes you do things with imperfect knowledge of the consequences or with imperfect knowledge of the circumstances. And 5 years later you may say, if I had only known that, I might have done differently. That's normal human behavior. I certainly don't think that anybody should claim to be so infallible, unless they're the Pope, that they would never actually change their mind. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be plenty of things that qualify. I don't want to sit here right now and think about what they are, but in principle, no problem at all.
Mr. Anand Suraj is here in the audience. Anand Suraj, please come on the stage. Please follow, make it fast. Yeah, any other one? Sir? Yeah.
So that's my last question, please.
Yes.
In 1946 Bombay Assembly, Ambedkar was defeated.
That's right.
And he passed from West Bengal. The West Bengal people elected him. See, what was the mindset of that public, sir? Those who defeated Dr. Ambedkar in Bombay.
Well, as Rajiv was saying, there's no question that he was not universally popular. In fact, he lost more elections than he won. That's the irony. He lost more elections than he won. He won in 37, and thereafter he lost in the 40s, he lost in the 50s also. In fact, in 1952, he fought 2 elections. The general election he lost came second, and then the by-election he came third. So we have to understand that politics is like that. The Congress party was more popular. And even if the seat was reserved for Dalits, the Congress would put up a Dalit. And the Congress voters, the majority of voters in the constituency are not Dalits. They were looking for the person who they wanted to see representing the overall constituency, not necessarily the strongest voice for the Dalit community. And this was the challenge Ambedkar had throughout his career, and I'm afraid what you saw in that example got repeated in subsequent elections. And he was not, therefore, electorally very successful in the system we had at that time.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we have to stop right here. Thank you very much.